When Azula receives a formal introduction early in the second season of Avatar: The Last Airbender, she appears indomitable. Unlike Zuko, who is defined by his failures, especially his failure to receive the support of his father, Azula is defined by the lavish support she receives. Ozai personally gives her the challenge of capturing Zuko. She is his favorite, and she had been even before he banished Zuko. Unlike Zuko, she absorbed without question his callous, tyrannical values, and unlike Zuko, she demonstrated firebending mastery from a young age. Because of this, she should seem perfect. She certainly thinks of herself in those terms, and because of this, her breakdown at the end of the series should seem bizarre and unnatural. Instead, it seems not only sensible and narratively earned, but also inevitable. Unable to overcome her flaws, or even recognize them as flaws, she is left staring into the gaping, bottomless pit that exists where her absolute trust and fear used to be. Her mental breakdown encourages one to view her character in a different context. To understand why this narrative decision succeeds, start with it and work backwards. There are clear lines leading up to it. Nearly every narrative decision the show makes regarding Azula gains extra dramatic resonance when viewed in the context of her eventual breakdown. That does not mean Azula should be reduced to her breakdown. That would be a reductionist view of a complex character, who has more layers than others, or even she herself, give her credit for. She is not just the young woman who sends away her allies, loses the final Agni Kai to a brother whom she believes herself superior to, and sobs in desperation after Katara chains her. She is also the cunning strategist who captures Ba Sing Se, a friend who can be decent when she tries to be, and an awkwardly vulnerable person contemplating the depths within herself. However, to understand why her mental breakdown is not just a brilliant narrative decision, but the only logical conclusion to the narrative the show provides her, working backwards, is imperative. This is Avatar Explained, Azula's Breakdown. The show deserves credit for how it depicts the breakdown itself. I have seen the decision to have her undergo this breakdown criticized, both because the show never clearly explains what her mental illness is, and because there is a long and unglamorous history of mad female leaders in fiction, subtly, or not so subtly, conveying the idea that women are less fit to rule. Both of these criticisms are, to me, unconvincing. The first is more ludicrous, so I'll deal with it first. While there is nothing wrong with giving characters clear symptoms of a certain illness, and indeed, this should be encouraged, requiring it is an example of forcing a show to prioritize social importance over dramatic effect. And even as a socio-political argument, it's weak, implying that all mental illnesses fall into easily definable categories, which is not really the case. As for the second criticism, it makes a little bit of sense until you start really thinking about it. Yes, the Mad Queen trope is overused and more than a little sexist, and if Azula was the only significant female character in Avatar, or if she was the only mad villain, this feminist argument would potentially have weight. However, Avatar: The Last Airbender is a show full of complex and vibrant female characters. There is Katara, the heart and the glue of the group. Of the four original members of Team Avatar, she is the most mature, and she is the most blazing hatred of injustice. There's Toph, the muscle of the group. She's more traditionally masculine than Katara, and she does love her quips, but although she tries to pretend that she is not vulnerable, the show isn't afraid to allow her to be vulnerable and divulge her deepest fears and concerns to those she cares about. This is not a Sansa Stark situation in which a female character is only allowed to be considered mature when all the compassion and empathy have been beaten out of them. Even among Azula's group, there is Mai and Ty Lee, neither of whom are particularly well developed, but both of whom are more interesting than the one-dimensional facades they present to the world. As saliently, the Avatar world has no shortage of villains, and many of these villains can be just as mentally unstable as Azula. Ozai wants to bring a fiery apocalypse to the Earth Kingdom, and Admiral Zhao wants to kill the moon. To be clear, that these characters have outlandish goals does not make them crazy. Sozin wanted to take over the world, but he was not crazy. Arrogant and self-impressed? Yes, but not mad. He had a clearly defined rationale, and he understood the methods needed to bring about the world he sought. Zhao, however, does not think about the consequences of a world with no moon. And Ozai's quasi-reasonable facade dissolves by the end of the third season to reveal a pitifully desperate man who wants to burn the world to the ground so that he can be king of the ashes. The only significant difference between Azula and those male villains is that the show devotes extraordinary empathy to portraying Azula's descent into madness. When Ozai is defeated in the series finale, Avatar Aang, Team Avatar mocks him, as without his political power he is nothing but a sullen, broken man. However, when Azula is defeated in the same episode, her brother and Katara look upon her with pity. They wish they could help her, despite the degree to which she has hurt them. This is not the series denying or downplaying her villainy. It never misunderstands the adverse impact she has had on the lives of others. It never views her as a moral person. Even Iroh, whom the show consistently portrays as the wisest person in the entire Avatar world, says of her, she's crazy and she needs to go down. However, it takes the time in midst an otherwise triumphant series finale to issue a reminder that Azula is still a 14-year-old who has suffered under the toxic burden of her father's expectations. This is more affecting than it otherwise would have been because the show has already portrayed in episode 305, The Beach, what she is like away from those expectations. The Beach is perhaps the foremost case for starting at the end of Azula's character arc and viewing it backwards. Viewed in the context of Azula's ultimate fate, her actions in this episode become more dramatically poignant. Her inability to connect with others serves as a harbinger of her eventual downfall, but that is not unique. That she lacks social skills is a fact the show has demonstrated prior to this point. The difference is that this is a lighter situation in which the show demonstrates empathy for Azula. Here, the difference between her and others does not make her threatening. Certainly, she issues threats, such as her seminal line about how a team she defeated in a beach volleyball match will never rise from the ashes of their shame and humiliation. Then there is her speech to her would-be boyfriend, which is not intended as a threat to him, but her words nonetheless intimidate him. However, the show does not present her as threatening here. She does nothing worse than destroy a little kid's sandcastle and ruin a party thrown by some rich jerks. Perhaps neither action was moral, but neither action caused any serious harm. Because her threat level is diminished, her domineering side does not inherently obscure her other sides. Even in a low-stakes situation like this, she's cruel and callous, even laughing when Zuko mocks Ty Lee by impersonating her, then calling her a circus freak. However, she's also isolated, vulnerable, and socially awkward, and these attributes become apparent no matter how hard she tries to obscure them. Viewed from the perspective of what Season 2 and very early Season 3 reveal about Azula, this is merely surprising and heartwarming. However, viewed from the perspective of the entire series, it becomes devastating. Azula may have elevated megalomaniacal failings, but she also has relatable everyday failings. And her being able to reach out to Zuko, imploring him to come to the beach with her, and talking about the bad memories the beach house has for them both, reveals that she is able to display empathy, albeit for limited sections of time. The show does not rely on her youth or the fact of her abuse to excuse her actions. Rather, it presents her cruelty with clear eyes, then makes her downfall haunting because of the sparks of compassion and yearning within her. and because of the person she could have been had circumstances been different. It's the more difficult approach to take artistically. It's also the right one. Avatar avoids the common conceit of having a villain commit horrible, unredeemable actions, then giving them a single positive trait and trying to act like they're complicated and morally ambiguous. It recognizes this conceit as a cheap, ineffectual shortcut. Moral ambiguity in art is very important. Works in which every character is either completely good or completely evil tend to be bland and tedious. However, imbuing a work with moral ambiguity requires maturity, and that is a trait too many flailing artists do not possess. Their sad attempts at moral ambiguity make their works worse than if they had just stuck to a simple moral binary. The show does not evoke care and concern for Azula by making her as palatable as possible. Rather, it makes her psyche messy and raw. And it pairs even her moments of tenderness and rawness with moments in which she fails to display any kind of regard for the well-being of her fellows. Hemingway once said, "When writing a novel, a writer should create real people. People, not characters. A character is a caricature." What he meant is that poorly written characters can be identified by the fact that the puppet strings are visible. The writer makes them act that way in order to evoke a desired reaction, not because the character would, in light of the information that has already been provided about them, act in that regard. Azula never does that, because the creators of Avatar eschew easy emotional catharsis involving her character. Her actions resonate more deeply than they otherwise would. There is nothing simplistic about her character, though that does not mean nothing is clear. The beach makes her downfall far more tragic, and in hindsight, the roots of her mental breakdown are present even in the first few episodes involving her character. The show does not call attention to this. Instead, it weaves this groundwork into episodes that are by themselves complete and distinct, without even considering how they function as pieces of a larger narrative. Azula's breakdown would not have been nearly as effective if the solemnity and inevitability of it had not been established beforehand. So one could forgive the show for using a few minor contrivances to communicate these traits. Instead, it manages to establish these traits while disguising them. This is a technique Avatar employs frequently. Katara's commitment to enforcing upon the world her framework of what is morally right, for example, may be lauded at points, but it's placed in such a context that the idea of her having a dark and violent side does not seem absurd. Zuko's determination to capture the Avatar may lead to strife and sorrow for both him and Team Avatar, but the same determination implores him to change for the better. In Azula's case, her view of herself as this infallible, godlike figure may amplify the threat she poses, but it also means that when she falls, she has no answers, and she slips into insanity. In a lesser series, Azula's breakdown would have been cheap, tawdry drama. In a lesser series, it would have been a desperate attempt to add layers to a simplistic character and to contrive a situation in which Zuko can defeat his sister in an Agni Kai. Instead, Azula's complexities have already been developed. Her breakdown pays off the setup that is her two distinct characterizations, those being her general characterization as someone whose perception of herself is intricately tied to her belief in her innate superiority, and her characterization in the beach as a forlorn, desperate young woman who badly needs help but will never ask for it, and who thinks of herself as a monster. Starting at the end point of her character arc and staring backwards, this becomes evident. The show builds up Azula's character in such a way so as to make her ultimate breakdown more devastating and dramatically satisfying. So thank you for watching. If you liked what you saw today, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Donate to my Patreon if you can and you want to see more content like this. Keep watching Avatar. It is a fantastic show with so many layers. Tune in soon for the next Avatar Explained video. It will be coming out soon-ish, i.e. within a week or so. Thank you all again. Adios, comrades.